Welcome, advocates, to another episode of the Leading Equity Podcast, a podcast that focuses on supporting educators with the tools and resources necessary to ensure equity at their goal. Today is the third day of our three-part series, and I am so excited to have Tara back with us. We're talking all about executive functioning. So without further ado, Tara, thank you so much for joining us again.
Great to be here, Sheldon. Excited to chat about our topic today.
Yeah, me too. So, folks, I got links in the show notes for our previous two episodes, so definitely check them out. But for those, if this is your first time listening, Tara, why don't you share with us a little bit about yourself and what you currently do?
Sure. So I come from a teaching background and then eventually school administration background. So learning and teaching has been part of my life, my career for decades. But for the last couple of decades, I've been with an organization that not just helps students and teachers, but also helps other schools. So we provide specialized programming for schools to deliver in their own communities to students. And we have a really specific way to support children, which of course we'll talk about today. And it's namely improving their brains, brain programs or brain-based learning programs that really change the way students learn and the way teachers understand their learning. So that's, again, why I'm happy to talk about today's topic and hopefully give a little bit of insight to your audience about maybe looking at their students a little differently.
I'm all about that life, looking at our students a little differently. So we don't want to assume that students are testing us, if you will, but maybe there's some other things. There's a bigger piece to the story there. And I think this topic today is going to really hone in on some of that. So let's get into it. I mean, executive functioning. Why don't you start with what is executive functioning?
Yeah, absolutely. I think not to put too fine a point on it, but it's up here. It's happening here. It's literally happening here. So executive function is a process in our brain, primarily a process in the very front of our brain, the what we call the prefrontal cortex in the left and the right hemispheres. And these and a couple of other brain networks, brain processes are absolutely critical in allowing us to think and problem solve and to be aware and to pay attention and to be resilient and curious in our thinking, to have some self-control. It's also related to processes like working memory and, as I said, flexible thinking, critical thinking, all of those aspects of thought that are so essential in our learning, but are so essential in day-to-day life. I love, Sheldon, what you said, kids aren't necessarily testing us. I think sometimes, as we talked about before we started recording, in part, there's some children at certain developmental stages that it's perfectly normal for them to test us. And though I've always said to my staff and even the parents with whom I support, if they would, they could. In other words, so rarely are children or our students intentionally not engaging with learning, are intentionally not wanting to pay attention, are intentionally switching off their executive function capacities. It's just not the case. It may be more difficult for them. So, like all learning, these processes in our brain, these executive function processes in our brain, we have a capacity, some degree of capacity. Each of us have a strength in our executive functioning thinking. So think about those students really that we rely on, those students that we know will keep track of their assignments, even other kids' assignments. They'll manage their own projects. They'll manage their own home life, part-time job. They seem to really have it together. Even those younger kids that seem to develop independence really quickly, maturity, we tend, as I said, to rely on them. They're the responsible ones, the ones we don't need to worry about. Well, the reality is they're not just raised well or, came out of the womb that way. They happen to have strong executive function. So then think about the other side of that spectrum. And these are children or adults. We all have them in their lives. Hopefully we are the ones that are helping people with their own problems or maintaining our own independence. But we know those children and those, as I said, these adults in our lives who rely on others to do the problem solving and to do the organization and to help them attend to their tasks or to redirect them to their tasks. And there are some students who really seem incapacitated in those processes, in those executive functioning processes, to sustain and keep attention, to make good and quick decisions, to delay gratification, the famous marshmallow test. That's part of this executive function world. So it doesn't mean that students are willfully disregarding, the norms, the academic norms, the social norms. It's because the processes, the parts of their brain that are responsible for executive functioning in general is weak. And then, of course, we have, you know, all of those students in between. We have students who can reasonably manage with independent tasks as long as they have a little bit of help, as long as they have a little bit of nudge. So they're somewhere in the middle of that
Yeah.
spectrum. So really executive function, a series of critical brain functions, essential in school, essential throughout life. And all of us have a certain degree of capacity, either strong or weak or somewhere in between.
Okay, thank you for setting the tone here, and I want to make sure I heard something right. Maybe I misheard it, so I want to ask a question because it sounded like you said having high executive functioning skills. Does that necessarily relate to you came from a certain type of home life? Is that what I heard? As far as like, it doesn't necessarily mean you came from. I just want you to clarify that because
Yeah.
I think that's what I heard.
Let me make sure I'm clear. I think
Okay.
in general, it's a really, whether we're talking equity, whether we're talking about key critical topic in learning, in education in general, I think what's really important is we are
Mhm.
born with a brain of a certain capacity, and that capacity is not fixed. That is not the brain
Right.
that we will live with or endure for the rest of our lives. It is constantly adapting, it is constantly growing and changing, and frankly, hopefully for the better. In other words, there are opportunities for positive brain growth, positive brain change, positive brain development. And of course, there is negative brain change. So in our first conversation, Sheldon, we talked about neuroplasticity, this capacity of our brains to change and grow. Well, equally, there's a capacity of our brains to be injured, to be damaged, or to be negatively rewired, not positively rewired, not made stronger, but certain connections made stronger in our brains that are actually leading to more damaging issues. For example, addiction is likely our brains being wired to repeat negative experiences until our brains, literally, that is our natural flow of activity. So, in learning and executive function, I do really want to reinforce that it's not a set of skills that can be taught from an early age, at an early age, or at least not necessarily. It's a part of our brain. They're not skills that can be taught, they're parts of our brains. And they're parts of our brains that may be strong from birth, they may be weak from birth, and they can be improved through positive or even specific exercise.
Okay, so I want to understand as far as where organization, like being organized, because you mentioned early in our conversation how there's certain students that we know they're
Yeah.
going to have their homework on time. They're going to do this. They're very organized. The locker looks good, looks clean. It's not their papers aren't falling out, all that kind of stuff. Where does organization fit within the executive functioning skills?
So it's a key part of it. The part of the brain, and again, it's likely the two areas here and here, although there are some other brain processes responsible for it. But these are the parts of our brain that direct behavior, and they're particularly driven to accomplish goals.
Hmm.
So the goal is a clean locker, or maybe the goal realistically is I want to be able to go to my locker and know exactly, where my history book is.
Yeah.
So that those brain processes develop a plan. They develop a plan and they put that plan in place. They execute that plan. And when something interferes or interrupts that plan, those brain processes actually come up with a plan B. So, for example, if they only have 30 seconds to get to their locker, they know they're not going to have time to get their history book.
Right.
Maybe in the period before, they grab their history book for first period, so they don't need to go back to their locker. So the parts of our brain that are constantly thinking, they're alert. These parts of the brain are active all the time. And when they're strong, they're really good at coming up with plans and coming up, as I said, with plan Bs and sometimes up to plan Zs, given the complexities of the world. So when someone has even a mild weakness in those brain processes, organization can be tough. Now, it's
Mhm.
not impossible, but it's tougher. It's not impossible to acquire some organizational skills, but it's either more difficult, takes more time, more mistakes happen, other people need to be involved, or some strategies. And that's a really common recommendation, not just for children with learning difficulties, but all of us rely on strategies. All of us rely on external methods of organization.
I know people will make excuses and say stuff like, "Oh, I didn't do it because I have ADHD and my executive functioning was kicking in." Folks will
Uh,
say stuff like that. I'm wondering if you could take some time to talk about what executive function is not. Like, what are some
yeah.
of the myths that are out there?
Yeah, I have found it really interesting to observe that this new trend or activity. And in some respects, I wouldn't say it's positive. I think it's sort of neutral. I think
Okay.
in some respects it's understandable. It's, as you say, kind of trendy. And maybe there are positive qualities about it in terms of normalizing struggle. And I think that's part of a movement, a bit of a movement in not in learning, I would say, but in self awareness, in self care, in health and wellness. I think actually, our response to COVID had a lot to do with this idea that let's be okay with not being okay
Hmm.
sometimes. And
Yeah.
let's share that vulnerability. So I think in part, it's been part of a much bigger, kind of movement in identifying vulnerability and identifying weakness, and that's okay. And in that respect, I'm here for it. I think it makes a lot of sense for all of us to be more comfortable and more insightful with our weaknesses as well as our strengths. But I think there's a risk here. First of all, I'm not sure for those who struggle with significant diagnosed ADHD or ADD, as it was previously called, or diagnosed and significant learning disabilities, I'm not sure how comfortable it feels for them to be a trend, to
Mm.
be a TikTok meme. I think, and I'm so sorry if I've mixed together. I don't know if TikTok is a
TikTok
meme.
meme. We'll go with it. Real, I think, is what they go with, but
Okay, I'm
yeah.
sorry. Just revealed my age. So I think there's a risk there that actually minimizing the very real struggle of having diagnosed and sometimes really debilitating experience for
Mm.
individuals and for their families. And I would argue it's not fun to be an individual who struggles every day with sometimes basic navigation of their world, whether they're in school or a work setting. Sometimes they can't maintain a professional setting because of their struggles. So I'm talking now about struggles in general, and executive function definitely is. It's not a formal diagnosis, although I certainly have read, and I'm sure you have too, lots of psych ed reports that refer to executive function as an area of difficulty or something that needs to be developed for an individual. But I think that the reality for someone experiencing those things and their families, for sure, for parents, for teachers,
Mhm.
there's nothing trendy about it, and it can be very painful, and there's real suffering there. So to that end, I think that there's a risk in being somewhat flippant about forgetting something and just you know saying, "Oh, it's my ADHD."
Right.
So, and so to your question, what isn't it?
Right.
I don't have a medical degree, so I can't diagnose anyone's ADHD or not ADHD, although there is a process for diagnosing such learning disabilities. But I think that what it isn't is maybe other qualities, and it may be other weaknesses. It may be other parts of their brain, or it may be the parts of their brain that are mildly underfunctioning. So to that degree, it perfectly makes sense for someone to self-identify saying, "Oh, I have this brain weakness and this causes me to do X, Y, and Z. I can never figure out how to divide up the check at the end of a nice meal with friends because I can't divide, by five and then add on the tax and the tip. And they had an extra drink and she didn't. And that's a mental load for me. And and I can't figure that makes perfect sense. And that's not necessarily a learning disability, and it doesn't necessarily require medication, frankly, but it's a form of a learning difficulty. And to that extent, I think we should be perfectly comfortable recognizing tasks that are difficult for us and then exploring why might those tasks be difficult. So, in the spirit of promoting your podcast and our series together, we have talked about being curious about the
Mhm.
why. Why is it that we or others behave in certain ways, learn in certain ways, or struggle to learn or struggle to behave in certain ways? And it's very reasonable to actually map back those processes or those tendencies to parts of our brain. It's more than reasonable. The brain is in everything we do. It's very likely that there's a part of our brain responsible for that task. And if that part of our brain is functioning just incrementally under how it's expected to operate, we may have those experiences.
Okay. So you mentioned like you're someone that's, I personally consider you as an expert, but I know you said, look, I don't have the education behind this. And so I'm assuming that there's things that we can look at. I'm thinking about teachers in the classroom. If we
Yeah.
have students
Yeah.
that aren't diagnosed, what are some, I don't know, symptoms that teachers could look out for that might show that maybe certain students might need some additional support when it comes to executive functioning skills?
Yeah, for sure. So, some really practical clues are how they manage independent tasks and the
Mhm.
degree to which they can manage independent tasks and the degree to which they can figure out that plan B that I mentioned. When they encounter a roadblock, do they get
Mhm.
stuck? And do they stay in that stuck position, or can they devise a plan B? Even if that plan B is raising their hand and saying, I can't figure it out, I need help. Or, reaching out to a friend and saying, I'm stuck on this one. Can I get some help? So even that active problem solving shows strength there, shows a capacity, an executive function process security there. Someone who is so passive in their activity and they just feel stuck and they can't even generate an idea, there's likely something there. There's likely some executive function difficulties. Another one, you mentioned the locker. So often physical spaces, notebooks, assignments, rooms, desks, if they are of chaos, that is likely an executive function difficulty versus, a systematic way of organizing, which we have the brain power to do that. Any multi-step projects. So are they a project that has scope beyond, that 30-minute lesson? Are they daunting or are they delightful? Because if they're
Mhm.
daunting, then that's likely a struggle there because the students don't have that core executive function to kind of get in line, to be goal oriented and to persevere through the end of that goal. The other aspect of executive function processes that probably are less understood or perhaps even misunderstood is the tendency to have social and emotional resilience. So, children with executive function difficulties have some tough times managing criticism, even constructive criticism, even from a peer. It's hard for them to kind of keep a level head because it's really hard for them cognitively to be flexible. It's not their ego necessarily. I mean, that's there too, but it's also there's an intellectual process of being able to take someone else's points of view, recognize that it's slightly different from their own, and to recognize that both have value and they're different and they may very well have their own positives and negatives. And when someone has a part of their brain that for which it's difficult to be flexible, to be able to see, the grays in between the blacks and whites, they can usually respond somewhat emotionally to it. They can be rigid, they can be stubborn, they can be angry, they can feel defensive. And as I said, to some degree, of course, there's ego there, there's psychology there, but there's also underneath the psychology is
Mhm.
the ability to which they can kind of compare and contrast. So definitely, if you see those students who tend to seemingly overreact in those situations where they have had feedback or where something doesn't feel fair to them, give yourself and them a moment to recognize that there's a brain process at play here, and it may not be strong for them. So those are hopefully a few
Yeah.
helpful tips. The other tool I would always recommend, and I can send it to you, Sheldon, and you can share it with your audience, is my organization has a questionnaire, a cognitive questionnaire that actually produces a report for an individual. Now, typically it's designed for families, for a parent or a guardian who is trying to get a sense of their child's, what we call it, the cognitive profile. So out of all the different cognitive processes that I've referred to today, which ones are strong, which ones are weak, and which ones are functioning somewhere in between. So it's a questionnaire that you can fill out, and when you submit it, you get a report back. So as much as it's designed for families, I often suggest it to educators. If they have a student in mind who, as you say, may not have a formal diagnosis, and I think given, I know here in my part of the world, I think in the average public school, it's a 2-year wait list to get a psych ed report from a registered psychologist. So there are likely many children in an average classroom that don't have a formal diagnosis, and it has nothing to do with not needing one or not having struggles. It's simply waiting. So sometimes this cognitive report, now it may not have any wider application in terms of being able to bring someone formal accommodations or modifications, but it can be, I think, insightful and give teachers some really practical strategies or insight to understand, okay, this is why this kid is having a tough go, and I'm going to either, try something differently, give them frankly a bit of a, not a break, but some compassion.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, some compassion. Because I'm just sitting there thinking, like, there's got to be students that are getting in trouble, disciplinary, teachers frustrated because the child forgot their homework, or, they little stop that, again, not intentional, but it's misread.
Yeah.
And I could just imagine the stats out there about the disproportionality rates or whatever from students that are harshly punished for things that are, like you said, in the brain that just aren't there yet.
One of the greatest misunderstandings and frankly tragedies I think we have in our school system, and I say system because I know there's many teachers and many schools that have a deeply compassionate view, and it's frankly built into their system, a kind of a non-punitive way of restoring justice and encouraging conversation. But at a system level, I think I agree with you, Sheldon. It is probably devastating, the number of misdiagnosed or misunderstood children in schools, in the justice system, in our lives that are misunderstood. And that's why, I often say if they could, they would, because no one wants to be the bad kid. And I will say that even to, a teenager who seems more than proud to be, expelled or suspended or has all the bravado in the world. I just don't believe it. I think that all children want to be the winner in their classrooms, on the sports field, in their world. So to think that, yeah, someone is intentionally or willfully trying to fail or not caring, I think it's short-sighted.
Okay.
I'll say one more thing, only because, I mean, to be fair, there is a tendency, and this is, well researched and statistically the case, there is a tendency, particularly for individuals with learning difficulties, to at some point to not give 200% or 100% or even 50% of their effort because they get so little in return, because they're constantly falling short or constantly falling behind. So at some point, it's very common for individuals with struggles like executive function struggles. And I don't mean necessarily those diagnosed, but just those who struggle with learning, struggling learners, failing learners. They do default to that sense of learned helplessness. They do wait for someone else to do it for them because they have just had too much failure and too much shame and too much frustration. So I think that eventually becomes It's not an inevitability. It's not for everyone, but it's common. But it only happens after years and years of that effort, huge amounts of effort and blood, sweat, and tears, and still falling short because of these cognitive issues.
So how do we help our kids? Let's take the diagnosis out of there. We're
Yeah.
teachers, we're principal, whoever, and we recognize that there are some challenges there when it comes to the executive functioning. What are some strategies that you can leave our educators with?
Yeah. So I think there's great materials out there in the world in general. I would say I'm not an expert in the executive functions because our work is to go underneath the strategies or beyond the strategies and give educators resources, cognitive exercises that go into the brain processes and strengthen them through the concept of neuroplasticity, what we've chatted about in our first conversation. So practically speaking, I think every educator deserves to have insight into the understanding. And again, I think the cognitive questionnaire I shared with you, there's lots and lots of information in my organization's website. We have a number of what we call practical guides, but they really help educators get a really strong sense of what is the brain's role in learning. So I'm going to share 2 of those guides with you, and I welcome educators to
Yes.
review them themselves and share them with their teams. And I think it gives good understanding, good direction, good insight, good compassion, as I said, and I think a really important starting point to understanding their students differently. So that insight and that understanding, I would absolutely love to give to your audience. In terms of strategies that can bypass executive function struggles, in terms of strategies that can lessen the impact of having executive function struggles, I would certainly encourage educators to look at programs that are already happening perhaps in their school or already in their resource room or in the staff room, because there are some great strategies for helping struggling learners. Strategies. So I'm going to make a distinction between strategies and, for example, cognitive programming. So strategies assume that the brain is fixed. Strategies assume that those learning struggles, including executive function struggles, are lifelong. So we introduce strategies like organizers, like timers, like getting records of notes, like breaking down material into chunks, like spacing. So these are all great learning strategies that I think are just good practice.
Yeah.
They're not, certainly they're not unique to executive function. I think it's just good practice. So those are strategies. There's also a much more comprehensive and bigger commitment from a school organization, which is to integrate cognitive programming into their school world. And that's something, again, my team is happy to support with, but it is a process. It's a commitment of mindset to recognize, in fact, the brain can change. And as part of a school's academic programming, there can also be cognitive programming. So schools here in Canada, across the US, offer cognitive programming alongside their academic programming. And what that means is they have students in brain exercises, doing daily brain exercises that are actually designed to target and strengthen those processes that I've been talking about today. The 2 prefrontal cortex, left and right hemisphere, each are brain exercises that target and strengthen those processes. So that's certainly the much more intentional and enduring benefit is a cognitive approach. And the strategies in the short term, of course, are valuable. And frankly, they give students, I think, the dignity they deserve, that they're not willfully or intentionally falling apart or falling behind, but that cognitively it's more difficult for them.
Love it, love it, love it. Thank you so much. Listen, I first of all, I want to thank you for your time, for spending all these nights with me recording these episodes, and just for sharing all this knowledge. I have truly learned a lot, and this is our 3rd episode, and I would love for you to maybe give us your final words of advice to our listeners as we kind of wrap up this series.
You know, Sheldon, I was thinking about it before we came on the call. I knew you'd be asking me this. So I did think of something, and I hope that
Okay.
it comes. I referred to it indirectly in our chat today, and it's, I hope not too cheesy, but I've seen it in our work. I've seen it around the world. So I know that it's backed by research. It's backed by science. And that's why it feels more than reasonable to say a strong brain is not born, it can be built. So that is what I'm going to leave with you.
Love it. A strong brain cannot be born. It's built.
A strong brain is not born,
Oh,
it can be built.
okay. See, my brain wasn't strong enough to remember that one little line.
There's an
I,
exercise for that.
well,
There
once
is
again,
truly. There, it's a fascinating. That's our next episode. You have to
yeah.
have me back in a few months' time, and we can talk about memory because it is a juicy. It's a
Oh,
great
yeah.
one, and it
Yeah.
all starts in our brain.
Okay, I'm with you. I'm with you. Well, once again, if we have some folks that want to connect with you, what's the best way to reach you?
Sure. I mean, we have our website, arrowsmith.ca. That's ARROWSMITH.ca, not the band. My direct email, I certainly don't mind sharing it. It's tbonner. So TBONNER @arrowsmith.ca. If you'd like a more gentle inquiry, then we have a general inbox, which is questions@arrowsmith.ca.
Tara, it has truly been a pleasure. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sheldon. Enjoyed it. Let's stay in touch.